What happens when a prejudiced teacher meets a brilliant student who refuses to be defined by her bias? When 14-year-old Marcus Thompson walks into Mrs. Sullivan's advanced mathematics class, he faces more than just complex equations, he faces deeply rooted prejudice that threatens to derail his dreams. But what if talent, determination, and dignity could speak louder than bias? Can one student's excellence change not just a teacher's mind, but an entire school system? Dear viewer, don't skip a moment to enjoy an unforgettable story of triumph that will make you question everything you thought you knew about education and prejudice. And, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published new stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. Marcus Thompson stood at the entrance of Riverside High School, his heart pounding against his chest like a drum. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and the imposing brick building loomed before him, its windows gleaming like watchful eyes. At 14, he was about to start his freshman year at one of the most prestigious schools in the district. "You've got this, baby," his mother's words from this morning echoed in his mind. Lisa Thompson had worked double shifts at the hospital for 3 years to move them into this school district. The memory of her tired smile as she straightened his collar this morning made him stand a little taller. The hallways buzzed with activity as students reunited after summer break. Marcus navigated through the crowd, his new backpack feeling unusually heavy on his shoulders. His schedule indicated his first class was Advanced Mathematics with Mrs. Catherine Sullivan in room 203. The classroom was already half full when he arrived. Marcus chose a seat in the second row, close enough to see clearly but not so close as to draw attention. He pulled out his notebook, the fresh pages crisp and full of possibility. Mrs. Sullivan entered precisely as the bell rang. She was tall and elegant, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, her heels clicking authoritatively against the linoleum floor. Her blue eyes swept across the room, taking inventory of her new students. When they reached Marcus, something flickered across her face, so quick he almost missed it, before she turned to write her name on the whiteboard. "Welcome to Advanced Mathematics," she announced, her voice carrying a hint of pride. "You're here because you've shown exceptional aptitude in mathematics." However, she paused, her gaze lingering on certain students, Marcus included. "Being selected for this class doesn't guarantee your success. This is a rigorous course that demands excellence." As Mrs. Sullivan began reviewing the syllabus, Marcus felt a growing unease. Every time he raised his hand to answer a question, her eyes would skip over him, calling on other students instead. When she distributed the preliminary assessment test, she dropped his paper on his desk without the encouraging smile she'd given others. During lunch break, Marcus found a quiet spot in the cafeteria. As he unpacked the lunch his mother had prepared, a sandwich with a note that read, "Proud of you," he overheard two seniors discussing Mrs. Sullivan. "She's tough but fair," one said. "If you work hard, she'll recognize it." Marcus wanted to believe that, but something in his gut told him it wouldn't be that simple. The rest of the day passed in a blur of new faces and information. His other teachers seemed pleasant enough, especially Mr. Rodriguez in biology and Ms. Chen in English. But he couldn't shake the feeling that his biggest challenge would be advanced mathematics, not because of the subject, but because of Mrs. Sullivan. When he got home that evening, his mother was preparing for her night shift at the hospital. She took one look at his face and sat down beside him at their small kitchen table. "Talk to me, Marcus. How was your first day?" He considered sugarcoating it but remembered their pact about honesty. "The school's great, Mom. Most of my teachers seem nice. But..." He hesitated. "But what, baby?" "My math teacher, Mrs. Sullivan. I don't think she likes me very much." Lisa Thompson's face softened with understanding and concern. She'd had similar conversations with her son before, but each time it broke her heart a little. "Remember what your grandfather always said. Excellence can't be denied forever. You show her what you can do, not with attitude, but with brilliance." Marcus nodded, drawing strength from his mother's words. She was right, he would prove himself through his work, just as she had done throughout her nursing career. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, he could hear his mother preparing to leave for her shift. The sound of her quiet movements reminded him of why he was at Riverside High. This wasn't just about him, it was about every sacrifice his mother had made, every extra shift she'd worked, every dream she'd put on hold. He pulled out his mathematics textbook and began working ahead, losing himself in the elegant logic of equations and proofs. Math had always been his sanctuary, a place where right and wrong were clearly defined, where effort and accuracy were all that mattered, or at least, should matter. As he solved problem after problem, Marcus made a silent promise to himself: he would excel in Mrs. Sullivan's class, not despite her apparent prejudice, but to rise above it. He would give her no choice but to recognize his abilities. The first few weeks at Riverside High settled into a routine, but for Marcus, each advanced mathematics class felt like walking through a minefield. Mrs. Sullivan's behavior had grown more obvious, not just to him, but to his classmates as well. During one particularly challenging lesson on quadratic equations, Marcus spotted an error in Mrs. Sullivan's solution on the board. He hesitated, remembering the cold dismissal he'd received the last time he'd raised his hand. But the mistake would confuse everyone if left uncorrected. He raised his hand, and for once, Mrs. Sullivan couldn't ignore him. He was the only one with a hand up. "Yes, Mr. Thompson." Her tone carried a hint of impatience. "I think there might be a mistake in the second step," he said carefully. "If you multiply both sides by the conjugate, the negative sign should carry through to the entire expression." The class fell silent. Mrs. Sullivan turned to the board, her shoulders tense. After a moment, she erased the step and rewrote it, incorporating Marcus's correction without acknowledgement. During lunch that day, Marcus retreated to his favorite spot in the library, pulling out his advanced calculus book, one he borrowed from the public library. He was deep into a complex integration problem when a shadow fell across his page. "That's not freshman mathematics," a deep voice observed. Marcus looked up to find Mr. James Cooper, the school's veteran science teacher, studying his work with interest. "No, sir," Marcus admitted. I like to work ahead." Mr. Cooper pulled up a chair, his eyes scanning the page of calculations Marcus had completed. "This is college-level work, son. And from what I can see, you're doing it correctly." For the next 30 minutes, they discussed mathematics, science, and the intersection of the two. Mr. Cooper shared stories about his own journey as one of the few black students in his graduate physics program 20 years ago. "I see Mrs. Sullivan teaches your math class," Mr. Cooper mentioned casually, though his eyes were sharp. Marcus nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. "She's known for being demanding," Mr. Cooper chose his words carefully. "But I've noticed things, Marcus. And I want you to know that my door is always open." That afternoon in advanced mathematics, Marcus felt Mr. Cooper's words giving him strength. When Mrs. Sullivan announced a pop quiz, he didn't let her lingering presence behind his chair disturb his concentration. He completed each problem methodically, double-checking his work. At home that evening, Lisa Thompson noticed a change in her son. "You seem different today, baby. Something good happened at school?" Marcus told her about Mr. Cooper, watching her face light up with relief. "Sometimes God sends us angels right when we need them," she said, pulling him into a hug. That night, Marcus received an email notification about the pop quiz results. Perfect score. He allowed himself a small smile, remembering Mrs. Sullivan's barely concealed surprise when she'd graded his paper in class. The next day, word of his perfect score spread through the freshman class. Sarah Chen, one of his classmates, caught up with him before class. "Hey, Marcus. I heard you aced Mrs. Sullivan's quiz. Would you mind helping me study sometime? That last section on complex numbers has me totally confused." Before he could answer, Mrs. Sullivan walked past them, her expression darkening. "Miss Chen, I'd recommend finding a more reliable study partner. Some students have ways of achieving scores they don't deserve." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Sarah looked bewildered, but Marcus felt a strange calm. In that moment, he understood that Mrs. Sullivan's behavior came from her own limitations, not his. "Actually," he said quietly, but clearly enough for Mrs. Sullivan to hear, "I'd be happy to help, Sarah. Maybe we could start a study group. Math is always more interesting when you can discuss it with others." That afternoon, Mr. Cooper found Marcus in the library again, this time surrounded by 3 other students as he explained the finer points of complex number operations. "You know," Mr. Cooper said later, as the other students were leaving, "the best way to fight ignorance isn't with anger, it's with excellence. And from what I'm seeing, you've got plenty of that to spare." Marcus thought about his mother's extra shifts, about Mr. Cooper's encouragement, about Sarah's friendship, and even about Mrs. Sullivan's thinly veiled hostility. Each of them, in their own way, was pushing him to be better, to reach higher, to prove that talent and determination knew no color. That evening, as he helped his mother fold laundry, Marcus realized something important. He wasn't just studying mathematics anymore, he was learning much more valuable lessons about perseverance, dignity, and the power of quiet excellence. The autumn leaves were turning golden outside Riverside High when the first major incident occurred. Marcus's study group had grown from 3 to 8 students, meeting regularly in the library after school. Their improved test scores had caught the attention of other teachers, but Mrs. Sullivan's resistance only intensified. On a crisp October morning, she strode into class clutching their graded midterm papers. "Overall, the results were acceptable," she announced, her lips pressed into a thin line. Though some scores were suspiciously high. The papers were distributed one by one. When she reached Marcus's desk, she practically slammed his test down, face down. He turned it over, his heart racing, another perfect score. But this time, scrawled in red across the top was a note, "See me after class." The remaining class period felt endless. Marcus could feel curious glances from his classmates, particularly Sarah, who shot him a concerned look. When the bell finally rang, he approached Mrs. Sullivan's desk with steady steps, despite his racing heart. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice artificially sweet, "would you care to explain how you achieved these results?" Marcus met her gaze. "I studied, Mrs. Sullivan. I did all the practice problems, plus extra exercises from—" "Let me be clear," she cut him off. "These answers match the solution key perfectly. Word for word. Even the work shown is identical. Because that's the correct way to solve. I find it hard to believe that someone of your background could maintain this level of performance without outside help." Her implication was clear as glass and sharp as a knife. Marcus felt heat rising in his neck, but his mother's words echoed in his mind, "Don't let anyone make you forget your dignity." He took a deep breath. "Mrs. Sullivan, I can solve any similar problem right now, if you'd like to test me." Her eyes narrowed. "That won't be necessary. You're dismissed. But know that I'll be watching very carefully from now on." That afternoon, the study group met as usual, but Marcus was quieter than normal. Sarah finally asked what was wrong, and he told them about Mrs. Sullivan's accusation. "That's completely unfair," Sarah exclaimed. "We all know how hard you work. And you're the one helping us understand this stuff better." "Maybe we should tell Mr. Cooper," suggested Michael, another group member. "Or the principal." Marcus shook his head. "No proof, just her word against mine. Besides," he managed a small smile, "the best response is to keep succeeding." At home that evening, he found his mother sorting through bills at the kitchen table, her nurse's uniform still on. She looked up as he entered, and her expression immediately shifted to concern. "What happened?" Marcus told her everything. Lisa Thompson's hands clenched around her coffee mug, but her voice remained calm. "You know what this is about, don't you?" "Yeah, Mom. I know." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Your father would be so proud of how you're handling this. You know that too, right?" Marcus nodded, thinking of the father he'd lost to cancer when he was 8. A mechanical engineer who'd love numbers as much as Marcus did. He always said that mathematics was the only true universal language, Marcus remembered. That 2 + 2 = 4 no matter who you are or what you look like. "That's right," his mother smiled. "And you keep speaking that language, baby. Keep speaking it until they have no choice but to listen." The next few weeks brought new challenges. Mrs. Sullivan began calling on Marcus constantly, seemingly hoping to catch him unprepared. Instead, he answered each question correctly, his voice never wavering. She started returning his homework with red marks for unclear work, though his solutions were as detailed as ever. Mr. Cooper watched from the sidelines, offering subtle support and guidance. Document everything, he advised one day. Keep all your graded work, all your tests. Just in case. The study group became Marcus's sanctuary. They met 3 times a week now, and their collective success was undeniable. Even students from other classes began asking to join, drawn by word of mouth about the freshman math prodigy who could explain complex concepts in ways that made them click. One day, Sarah brought an article about Katherine Johnson, the black mathematician who helped NASA put astronauts on the moon. Reminded me of you, she said, handing it to Marcus. She faced people who didn't want to believe in her abilities too. The article became a talisman of sorts for Marcus. He pinned it inside his locker, a daily reminder that excellence couldn't be denied forever. But as the semester progressed, the pressure from Mrs. Sullivan grew more intense, building toward an inevitable breaking point. The incident that changed everything happened on a Wednesday in late November. The class was working on parametric equations, and Mrs. Sullivan had written a complex problem on the board. As she worked through the solution, Marcus noticed a critical error in her calculations. He hesitated, remembering every previous confrontation, every dismissal, every veiled insult. But the mathematician in him couldn't let it go. The error would affect everyone's understanding of the concept. Marcus raised his hand. Mrs. Sullivan ignored him at first, continuing with her incorrect solution. He kept his hand up, and finally, she couldn't pretend not to see it anymore. Yes, Mr. Thompson. Her voice carried a warning edge. There's a mistake in the parameterization, he said carefully. If you look at step 3, the derivative should be negative because... Mr. Thompson, she cut him off sharply, if you think you can teach this class better than I can, perhaps you'd like to come up here and take over. The class fell silent. Marcus could feel every eye on him. After a moment's hesitation, he stood up. I can show you where the error is, he said quietly, walking toward the board. Mrs. Sullivan's face flushed red. Sit down immediately. But the solution is wrong, Marcus persisted, his voice still calm. It should be negative x instead of positive, and that changes the entire. Enough. Mrs. Sullivan's shout made everyone jump. She strode toward Marcus, her heels clicking like angry punctuation marks on the floor. I have had enough of your disruptive behavior, your showing off, your constant need to undermine my authority. Marcus stood his ground, though his heart was hammering. I'm just trying to help everyone understand. Oh, I know exactly what you're trying to do, she spat, her careful facade finally cracking completely. You think you're so clever, don't you? With your perfect scores and your little study group. Well, let me tell you something, I've been teaching advanced mathematics for 15 years, and I know when something isn't right. The class watched in stunned silence as she continued, her voice rising with each word. You want to know what I think? I think you're a fraud. I think you've been cheating all along, and I'm going to prove it. You want to know what's going to happen? You'll fail. And I'll make sure of it. The silence that followed her outburst was deafening. Marcus stood perfectly still, his father's words about dignity ringing in his ears. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. The derivative is negative because we're moving clockwise around the curve. I can prove it using the chain rule. And I haven't cheated on anything, Mrs. Sullivan. I just love mathematics. He turned and walked back to his desk, picked up his books, and headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned back one last time. The error is still on the board. It's going to confuse everyone who tries to solve similar problems. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Marcus walked straight to Mr. Cooper's classroom, though it was empty at this hour. He sat at a desk and finally allowed his hands to shake, his breath to come in quick gasps. That's where Mr. Cooper found him 15 minutes later. Sarah Chin came to find me, Mr. Cooper explained, pulling up a chair. She told me what happened. Marcus nodded, still trying to process everything. You know this isn't over, Mr. Cooper said gently. She's going to try to make good on her threat. I know. Marcus looked up at his mentor. What do I do now? Now we fight smart. Mr. Cooper pulled out a notebook. Tell me everything that's happened, from the beginning. Every grade, every comment, every interaction. We're going to document it all. As Marcus talked, Mr. Cooper took detailed notes. Occasionally he would ask for clarification or specific dates. When Marcus finished, Mr. Cooper studied his notes for a long moment. "You've handled this with remarkable maturity," he said finally. "But you shouldn't have had to. This stops now." They spent the next hour developing a plan. Marcus would continue attending class and doing his work with the same excellence as always. Mr. Cooper would speak with the principal about having an independent evaluator grade Marcus's future work. Most importantly, Marcus would not let Mrs. Sullivan's words shake his confidence. When Marcus got home that evening, he found his mother already there, seated at the kitchen table. Mr. Cooper had called her. "Baby," she said, opening her arms. Marcus walked into her embrace, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of the day. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "So proud. But you're not alone in this fight anymore." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, working through problem after problem in his calculus book. Each equation he solved felt like an act of defiance, each correct answer a shield against Mrs. Sullivan's accusations. Around midnight, his mother came in with 2 cups of hot chocolate. "Your father used to do this too," she said, setting 1 cup beside him. "Work on equations when he couldn't sleep. Said it helped him make sense of a world that sometimes didn't make any sense at all." Marcus looked at the problem he'd just finished. "It does help. In mathematics, there's always an answer. It might be complex, it might be difficult to find, but it exists. And it doesn't care who finds it." Lisa Thompson watched her son, this boy who'd had to grow up too fast, who'd learned to fight ignorance with excellence. "You know what I think," she said. "I think Mrs. Sullivan isn't just wrong about you. I think she's afraid of you. Afraid of what you represent, all her preconceptions being proved false, one equation at a time." Marcus considered this, rolling his pencil between his fingers. "Maybe," he said finally. "But I'm not doing this to prove her wrong anymore. I'm doing it because it's who I am. Because I love it." His mother smiled. "And that, my brilliant boy, is exactly why you're going to win." The day after the confrontation, Marcus woke up before his alarm. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Mrs. Sullivan's words echoing in his mind, "You'll fail. And I'll make sure of it." For the first time since starting at Riverside High, he seriously considered giving up. The smell of breakfast drew him to the kitchen, where he found his mother making pancakes despite having worked a night shift. She looked tired but determined. "Sit," she said, placing a plate in front of him. "We need to talk." Marcus picked at his food while his mother sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "Mr. Cooper called again last night," she began. "He's already spoken with Principal Richards." "What did they say?" "They're taking it seriously." "But," she paused, choosing her words carefully, proving discrimination isn't always straightforward. "Mrs. Sullivan has tenure, and apparently, she's never had any formal complaints filed against her." "Because who would dare?" Marcus muttered. "Exactly. Which is why what you do next is so important." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Baby, I need to tell you a story about your grandfather." Marcus looked up, surprised. His mother rarely spoke about her father, who had passed away before Marcus was born. "Your grandfather was the first black man to work as an engineer at Western Electric in our town. Every day for 3 years, his supervisor would check his work 3 times over, looking for mistakes that weren't there. Some colleagues wouldn't share important information with him, hoping he'd fail." She stood up and walked to the bookshelf, returning with an old photograph. It showed a distinguished-looking man in a suit, standing proudly in front of an office building. "You know what he did? He became the best engineer they had. So good that when other companies tried to headhunt him, Western Electric gave him a promotion to keep him. He used to say, 'Excellence is the one language bigotry can't speak.'" Marcus studied the photograph, seeing his own determination reflected in his grandfather's eyes. "The thing is," his mother continued, "he didn't just succeed for himself. 5 years after he started, that same company hired 3 more black engineers. Sometimes, baby, our struggles aren't just about us. Marcus thought about his study group, about the younger students who had started coming to him for help. Like ripples in a pond, he said quietly. Exactly. She squeezed his hand. So, what are you going to do? Marcus straightened in his chair. I'm going to excel. Not just pass, excel. But Mom, I need your help with something. Together, they spent the morning making calls. By afternoon, Marcus had appointments with 3 different academic counselors and had registered for the upcoming state mathematics competition. He also had a meeting scheduled with Principal Richards for the following morning. The meeting with the principal was both encouraging and frustrating. While sympathetic, Principal Richards seemed more concerned with maintaining peace than addressing the underlying issue. We'll have another teacher observe Mrs. Sullivan's class twice a week, he offered. And your remaining tests will be graded by the department head. That's not enough, Marcus said firmly, surprising himself with his boldness. What about the other students? What about next year's students? Principal Richards shifted uncomfortably. These situations are complex, Marcus. We need to handle them delicately. With all due respect, sir, there's nothing delicate about discrimination. After school, Marcus met with Mr. Cooper to discuss the principal's response. His mentor looked unsurprised. Institutions resist change, Mr. Cooper said. But you know what changes them? Documentation. Results. Proof that can't be ignored. He pulled out a folder. Which is why I've been doing some research. Inside the folder were printouts about famous black mathematicians and scientists, Katherine Johnson, Benjamin Banneker, David Blackwell. But more importantly, there were statistics about academic achievement gaps and the impact of teacher bias on student performance. Knowledge isn't just power, Marcus. It's armor. It's ammunition. And right now, you need both. That evening, Marcus created a detailed study schedule that would prepare him not just for Mrs. Sullivan's class, but for the state mathematics competition. He also started researching college-level mathematics courses, determined to push his abilities further. When his mother came home from her shift, she found him surrounded by books and papers, making notes with intense concentration. You've made your decision, haven't you? She asked. Marcus nodded. Grandfather was right, Mom. Excellence is the one language bigotry can't speak. So I'm going to speak it fluently. The weeks following the confrontation brought subtle but significant changes to Riverside High. The presence of another teacher in Mrs. Sullivan's classroom twice a week created an atmosphere of forced civility. While she no longer openly antagonized Marcus, her cold hostility remained palpable. Marcus's study group had evolved into something larger than himself. They now met in Mr. Cooper's classroom instead of the library, and the group had grown to include students from different grades and classes. Marcus made sure to document everything: attendance, topics covered, improvement in test scores. Sarah had become his closest ally, her quiet support unwavering. One day, she arrived at their study session with an unexpected suggestion. We should film our sessions, she said. Not just for documentation, but for other students who can't stay after school. The idea took root. With Mr. Cooper's permission, they began recording their problem-solving sessions. Marcus found that explaining concepts to a camera helped him articulate his thoughts more clearly, and the videos became popular among students preparing for exams. Mrs. Sullivan's reaction to this development was predictable. I understand you're running some kind of tutorial service, she said during class one day, her voice dripping with disdain. I hope you're not teaching them any incorrect methods. Every solution is proven using theorems from our textbook, Mrs. Sullivan, Marcus responded calmly. Would you like to review the videos? She declined, but Marcus noticed her watching him more closely during class, as if searching for any sign of weakness or mistake. He responded by being more thorough than ever, double-checking each solution, citing specific theorems for every step. At home, his mother noticed the toll it was taking. You're working too hard, baby, she said one night, finding him still studying at midnight. I have to, Mom. I can't give her any ammunition. Lisa Thompson sat beside her son. I understand that. But you need rest too. Your father used to say that a tired mathematician is a mistake waiting to happen. Marcus smiled at the mention of his father. Did I ever tell you about his last project? The one he was working on in the hospital? His mother shook her head. He was solving equations even then. Said it helped with the pain. The nurses thought he was just scribbling nonsense, but he was working on optimization problems for drug delivery systems. Marcus's voice grew quiet. He wanted to help, right until the end. The next day at school, Marcus arrived early to find Mr. Cooper waiting for him. "I've been watching your videos," his mentor said. "You have a gift for teaching, Marcus. You don't just solve problems, you help others understand how to think about them. I just explain things the way I wish they'd been explained to me." "Exactly. That's what makes you effective." Mr. Cooper paused. "The state competition is in 3 weeks. How's your preparation going?" Marcus showed him his study schedule and practice problems. Mr. Cooper nodded approvingly but pointed to the schedule. "You need to add something else here, rest. Mental preparation is as important as technical preparation." The next study session, Marcus shared this insight with his group. "We're not just learning mathematics," he told them. "We're learning how to think, how to approach problems, how to stay calm under pressure." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Like how you handle Mrs. Sullivan's class. You never let her see you sweat." "That's because mathematics isn't about emotion," Marcus replied. "It's about logic, proof, and understanding. Personal feelings don't change whether an answer is right or wrong." As the state competition approached, Marcus maintained his rigorous schedule while incorporating periods of rest and reflection. He began each day by solving one complex problem, approaching it with the same calm determination he brought to Mrs. Sullivan's class. The recording sessions continued, and something unexpected happened. Students from other schools began asking for access to the videos. Mr. Cooper helped set up a proper online platform, and soon their little study group had virtual participants from across the district. One afternoon, Principal Richards visited their session. He watched as Marcus walked a struggling student through a difficult calculus problem, breaking it down into manageable steps, encouraging critical thinking rather than mere memorization. "Remarkable," the principal muttered, making notes in his pad. After the session, he pulled Marcus aside. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I should have taken more decisive action earlier. But you've turned this situation into something positive. You're not just proving Mrs. Sullivan wrong, you're elevating the entire school's mathematics program." Marcus thought about his grandfather, about his father, about every person who had faced discrimination and chosen to respond with excellence rather than anger. "That's the point, isn't it?" he replied. "It was never just about proving someone wrong. It's about proving what's possible when you refuse to let others define your limits." That evening, as Marcus worked through practice problems for the competition, he felt a new sense of calm. Mrs. Sullivan's hostility, rather than breaking him, had forced him to dig deeper, to be more thorough, to reach higher. His mother found him smiling over his textbook. "Good problem?" she asked. "No, just thinking. Remember when you said sometimes our struggles aren't just about us? I think I finally understand what you meant." Lisa Thompson looked at the stack of thank you notes from students her son had helped, at the growing collection of recorded sessions, at the competition preparation materials spread across his desk. "Your father used to say that mathematics was a universal language," she said softly. "But you're teaching more than mathematics, baby. You're teaching courage." As winter settled over Riverside High, the pressure began mounting. The state mathematics competition was just a week away, and the final exams would follow shortly after. Marcus's study group had become a hub of intense preparation, with students from all grades gathering to tackle practice problems. "You've got this," Sarah reassured him one afternoon, as they reviewed particularly challenging calculus problems. "You're more prepared than anyone." But Marcus knew the stakes were higher than just winning a competition or passing an exam. Each evening, when he returned home, he found his mother had left encouraging notes on his desk, quotes from famous mathematicians, words of wisdom from his grandfather, or simple expressions of love and pride. One night, she came home early from her shift to find him still awake, surrounded by practice tests. "I ran into Mrs. Chen at the hospital today," she said, setting down her bag. Sarah's mother. "She told me something interesting." Marcus looked up, curious. She said Sarah used to hate mathematics. Was afraid of it, actually. Now she's thinking about majoring in engineering. Lisa Thompson sat beside her son. You did that, baby. You showed her it wasn't something to fear. Marcus thought about Sarah's transformation from a hesitant student to one of the group's strongest members. She did the work, he said. I just showed her how to approach it. Sometimes that's all people need, someone to show them what's possible. The next day at school, Marcus noticed something different in Mrs. Sullivan's class. The observing teacher, Mr. Peterson, was taking more detailed notes than usual. Mrs. Sullivan seemed tense, her movements sharp and irritated. During lunch, Mr. Cooper pulled Marcus aside. The school board is coming to observe next week, he explained. Apparently, our math tutorial videos have caught their attention. The improvement in test scores across all grades hasn't gone unnoticed either. Marcus felt a mix of anxiety and vindication. Is that why Mrs. Sullivan seems more agitated? Mr. Cooper nodded. Keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. Excellence speaks for itself. That afternoon study session was larger than ever. As Marcus explained a complex integration technique, he noticed several students recording on their phones. The videos had become a lifeline for many, especially those who couldn't attend in person. Why do you make it look so easy? One freshman asked, frustration evident in his voice. Marcus smiled, remembering his own struggles. It's not easy. But it's like learning a language. At first, every word is a challenge. Then one day, you realize you're thinking in that language without even trying. As the session wrapped up, Sarah stayed behind to help clean the whiteboards. My mom told me she met your mother at the hospital, she said. She also told me something else, about Mrs. Sullivan. Marcus paused in his cleaning. What about her? Apparently, she was passed over for department head last year. The position went to someone younger, with new teaching methods. Someone who emphasizes understanding over memorization. Sarah gave him a meaningful look. Kind of like how you teach. The information settled in Marcus's mind, adding a new dimension to Mrs. Sullivan's behavior. It didn't excuse it, but it helped him understand it better. That evening, as he prepared for bed, his mother brought him a package that had arrived earlier. Inside was a letter from the university where his father had studied, along with information about their summer mathematics program for high school students. Your father would be so proud, his mother said, her voice thick with emotion. Not just of your mathematics, but of how you're handling everything. Marcus hugged her tightly, drawing strength from her unwavering support. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, he felt ready for them all. The morning of the final exam dawned cold and clear. Marcus had barely slept, but his mind felt sharp, focused. He found his mother in the kitchen, making his favorite breakfast despite having worked all night. I couldn't sleep either, she admitted, setting a plate of French toast in front of him. But I remember what your father always said before a big test. The preparation is the performance, they said together, sharing a smile. When Marcus arrived at school, he found the hallways buzzing with nervous energy. The final exam would count for 40% of their grade, and Mrs. Sullivan's reputation for difficult tests was well known. Sarah met him at his locker. Did you hear? The school board is here today. They're sitting in on the exam. Marcus nodded, having expected as much. As they walked to class together, other students from their study group fell in step with them, a silent show of solidarity. The classroom was arranged differently when they entered. The desks were spaced further apart, and at the back of the room sat 3 people Marcus didn't recognize, presumably the school board members. Mr. Peterson was there too, along with Principal Richards. Mrs. Sullivan stood at the front, her face an unreadable mask. As she began distributing the test papers, Marcus noticed her hands trembling slightly. You have 2 hours, she announced, her voice clipped. Show all your work. Any suspicion of cheating will result in immediate failure. Marcus took a deep breath and opened the test booklet. The first page contained a complex optimization problem, exactly the kind they'd been practicing in the study group. He smiled slightly, remembering all the times they'd worked through similar questions. As he worked through the problems, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm. Each equation was like an old friend, each theorem a trusted tool. He showed his work meticulously, adding explanations where needed, proving each step. Halfway through the exam, he heard a small sound of frustration from somewhere behind him. Without looking up, he knew others were struggling. But he kept his focus on his own paper, remembering Mr. Cooper's advice: stay in your own lane. Run your own race. Time seemed to flow differently during those 2 hours. Marcus was so absorbed in the mathematics that he barely noticed Mrs. Sullivan's periodic walks through the classroom, or the murmured conversations between the observers at the back. With 15 minutes remaining, he began his final review. Each solution was checked, each step verified. As he worked, he realized something: he wasn't just solving problems anymore. He was demonstrating everything he'd learned, not just about mathematics, but about persistence, precision, and dignity. 5 minutes, Mrs. Sullivan announced, her voice tight. Marcus had just finished his final check. He closed his booklet and sat back, feeling a profound sense of completion. Around him, other students were frantically writing, erasing, calculating until the last second. Time's up. Put your pencils down. As Mrs. Sullivan collected the papers, Marcus noticed the school board members conferring quietly among themselves. Mr. Peterson was making notes, and Principal Richards wore an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Outside the classroom, Sarah was waiting. "How did you do?" "I did my best," Marcus replied. "That's all anyone can do." They walked together to Mr. Cooper's classroom, where other study group members were already gathering. The atmosphere was a mix of relief and anxiety as they compared answers and discussed the problems. "That optimization problem was just like the one from our Tuesday video," someone pointed out. "And the integration question, we covered that exact type last week." Marcus listened to their discussions with a growing sense of satisfaction. The study group had done more than prepare them for a test, it had built a community of learners who supported each other. Mr. Cooper arrived, closing the door behind him. "I heard the test was challenging," he said, looking around the room. "It was fair," Marcus replied. "Difficult, but fair." "That's because you were ready for it," Mr. Cooper said. "All of you were." Later that afternoon, as Marcus packed up to leave, Principal Richards appeared at the classroom door. "A moment, Marcus." They walked together down the quiet hallway. "The school board was very impressed today," the principal said. "Not just with the exam, but with the overall improvement in mathematics performance across all grades. They've been watching your tutorial videos." Marcus waited, sensing there was more. "They've suggested implementing a peer tutoring program across all subjects, using your model as a template." Principal Richard stopped walking and turned to face Marcus. "Sometimes, change comes from unexpected places." That evening, as Marcus helped his mother with dinner, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever the result of the exam, he knew he had done more than just pass a test, he had shown a better way forward. "You know what I realized today," he said to his mother as they sat down to eat. "What's that, baby?" "Mathematics isn't just about getting the right answer. It's about showing your work, every step, every reason, every proof. Just like life." Lisa Thompson reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "That's wisdom, son. That's wisdom." The day of the results dawned bright and crisp. Marcus had barely slept, but not from anxiety. He'd spent most of the night helping his mother prepare for a job interview. She was applying for a head nurse position, inspired, she said, by watching him face his own challenges. "Whatever happens today," she told him as he left for school, "remember that your worth isn't measured by a number on a page." The hallways of Riverside High buzzed with nervous energy. Students clustered around lockers, phones in hand, waiting for the notification that results had been posted. Marcus's study group had gathered in their usual spot, supporting each other through the tension. "They're up," someone shouted from down the hall. The crowd surged toward the main notice board where the results were being posted. Marcus held back, letting others go first. Sarah stayed beside him, her presence calm and steady. "Whatever happens," she echoed his mother's words, "you've already won. Look around you." Marcus did look around. He saw students from his study group helping others navigate the crowd, saw them supporting those who were anxious, saw the community they'd built together. It was more than he'd ever expected to achieve. Principal Richards appeared, posting the final sheet of results. The crowd's reaction was immediate: gasps, cheers, some tears. Marcus finally moved forward, Sarah at his side. He didn't have to look hard. His name was at the top of the list. Perfect score. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. Marcus felt Sarah's hand squeeze his arm in excitement, heard the cheers from his study group members. But his eyes were drawn to another figure at the edge of the crowd. Mrs. Sullivan stood there, her face pale, her hands clutching a copy of the results. As their eyes met, something shifted in her expression, not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Mr. Cooper appeared beside Marcus, beaming with pride. "Not just the highest score in the class," he said quietly. "The highest score in Riverside High's history." The news spread quickly. Students Marcus had never spoken to came to congratulate him. Teachers stopped him in the hallway to shake his hand. But the most meaningful moment came when a freshman girl approached him shyly. "I watched all your tutorial videos," she said. "They helped me get an A. I never thought I could be good at math before." That afternoon, Principal Richards called a special assembly. The school board members were present, along with several local education officials. Marcus sat between his mother and Mr. Cooper as the principal addressed the school. "Today, we celebrate not just academic excellence, but the power of perseverance, teaching, and community," Principal Richards began. "What began as one student's journey has transformed into a model program that we plan to implement across our district." He went on to announce the creation of the Thompson Tutorial Initiative, a peer-led educational support program inspired by Marcus's study group. The program would receive official funding and support, expanding to all subjects. As applause filled the auditorium, Marcus felt his mother's hand slip into his. Her eyes shone with tears of pride. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. "So proud." The final week of the semester brought changes no one had expected. Mrs. Sullivan requested a meeting with Marcus and his mother, supervised by Principal Richards and Mr. Cooper. The tension in the room was palpable as they all sat down. Mrs. Sullivan spoke first, her voice different from anything Marcus had heard before, quieter, less certain. "I owe you an apology, Marcus," she began. "My behavior was unprofessional. Prejudiced. Wrong." She paused, seeming to struggle with her words. "I've been teaching for 15 years, and I realized I've been doing it wrong for all of them." She explained how watching his tutorial videos had forced her to confront not just her bias, but her entire approach to teaching. "You didn't just prove me wrong about you," she said. "You proved me wrong about teaching itself." Marcus listened, feeling a complex mix of emotions. His mother's hand remained steady on his arm, grounding him. "I've submitted my resignation as a classroom teacher," Mrs. Sullivan continued. "I'll be taking a sabbatical to pursue additional education courses, focusing on inclusive teaching methods and modern pedagogical approaches." Principal Richards then revealed that the school board had been investigating Mrs. Sullivan's grading patterns over the years, finding troubling disparities in how she evaluated students of different backgrounds. "Your documentation made this possible," Mr. Cooper told Marcus later. "Your videos, your detailed notes, your systematic approach, you built a case that couldn't be ignored." The news of Mrs. Sullivan's departure spread quickly, but Marcus insisted that his study group maintain its professional attitude. "We're not here to celebrate anyone's downfall," he told them. "We're here to lift everyone up." As the semester wound down, Marcus received more news. He had won the state mathematics competition, qualifying for the national level. But more meaningful to him was the impact his study group had made. Every single regular participant had improved their grades significantly. One afternoon, as he was preparing materials for the next semester's tutorial program, Sarah brought him a surprise, a scrapbook the group had put together. It contained screenshots from their first video tutorials, photos of study sessions, thank you notes from students, and newspaper clippings about their success. "We wanted you to have proof," she said, "that one person really can change things." The final day of the semester, Marcus's mother took off work to attend a special ceremony. The school board was officially launching the Thompson Tutorial Initiative, with Marcus as its first student director. But before the ceremony, she took him to visit his father's grave. "You know," she said as they stood there, "your father used to say that mathematics was a universal language. But you've taught it in a way that speaks to the heart as well as the mind." The ceremony itself was moving, but the most powerful moment came afterward, when a group of parents approached Marcus. Their children had been in his study group, and they wanted him to know the difference he'd made. "My daughter believes in herself now," one mother said. "My son finally sees that he belongs in advanced classes," another added. That evening, as Marcus sat in his room looking at the scrapbook, he found a note from Mr. Cooper tucked inside. "You came here to learn mathematics, but you ended up teaching us all something far more important. You showed us that excellence isn't just about numbers and formulas, it's about lifting others as you rise. Your grandfather would be proud. Your father would be proud. And I am proud to have witnessed your journey. Remember, the best teachers are eternal students, and the best students never stop teaching others. Your story isn't ending, it's just beginning." Marcus smiled, thinking about the new semester ahead, the expanded tutorial program, the national competition. He thought about the freshman girl who'd found confidence through his videos, about Sarah discovering her love for engineering, about all the future students who would benefit from the changes they'd helped create. His mother appeared in the doorway. "Ready for dinner?" "Almost," he said, solving one last equation in his notebook. "You know what, Mom? I finally understand what grandfather meant about excellence being a language bigotry can't speak. Oh. It's not just about proving people wrong. It's about showing them a better way forward. When you excel with dignity, you give others permission to do the same." Lisa Thompson smiled at her son, seeing in him the best of his father, his grandfather, and something uniquely his own. "That's wisdom, baby," she said softly. "That's wisdom." This story reminds us that prejudice in education isn't just about individual bias, it's about the opportunities we deny and the talents we suppress. Every student deserves to be judged by their abilities, not their appearance. But change doesn't just happen, it requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to excel even when others doubt you. If this story moved you, be part of the change. Share it with educators, students, and anyone who needs to hear this message. Together, we can build a world where every student has the chance to shine. Like this video if you believe in the power of education to transform lives, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that challenge prejudice and celebrate triumph against all odds.